Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday seminar series on behalf of the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. I'm Sareh. Today, we are proud to have Dr. Sareh Afshar, an associate research scholar at our center, presenting on ambiguity in the archive, performances of death, and the Iranian war generation. Dr. Afshar is a graduate of the Department of Performance Studies at New York University. She also holds an MA in Communication and MS in Learning Technologies and Media Systems. Her research and teaching interests reside at the intersection of performance and politics, with an emphasis on the politics of representation, materiality of visuality, and transnational queer feminist praxis. Prior to joining Princeton, she served as a postdoctoral fellow in gender studies at Brown University's Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Afshar.
Thanks so much, Ragim, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for hosting us, and a very heartfelt thanks to our own Allison Cummins for bringing us all together here today. Before I jump into the talk, you should all have before you or have handed out to you an index card. And I want to prompt you all to complete a sentence, which is, I will be free when. As you think of and hopefully jot down your answers, I'll share why I wanted to preface my talk with this prompt, which I constantly remind myself is what is at stake in my line of research. That is the question of freedom, the many answers it conjures, and the futures it requires us to imagine. What I present today sits at the center of my larger project called Authority and Ambiguity, which deals with what I theorize as performances of death as a framework through which one Iranian generation knows itself and is known to others. Central to my project are the artistic and media productions and quotidian and ritual practices of the war generation, born in the lead up to the revolution and the subsequent Iran-Iraq war, so think 78 to 88. My work argues that the hypervisual performances that materialize around death and its commemoration interrogate how commemorative practices shape the war generation's socio-political agency and offer insight into their movements for change. They help demystify the relationship between death, destiny, and procedures of power in the social imaginary of post-revolutionary Iran and render possible alternative collective futures. Performances of death are developed and taken up by the war generation and the state. An instance of the former, the ones taken up by the war generation, appears in a photo series by Azadeh Akhlaqi, a conceptual artist born in 1978. The 2013 series, which I'll be discussing in framing the politics of mourning in Iran, is called By an Eyewitness. It features 17 reconstructions of the visually undocumented deaths of historic 20th century figures in Iran and offers imagery previously unavailable to Iranians, or really anywhere at all. So let me start by telling you a story about three people: Azar Shariat Razavi, Mustafa Bozorgnia, Ahmad Ghanchi. The archive holds no image of the moments of their deaths. These three University of Tehran, or UT students, were written into contemporary Iranian history after they were shot down on December 7, 1953, when Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Shah's police force opened fire on students crowding the second-floor corridor of the Faculty of Engineering, known locally as Fanni. As Shariat Razavi's brother details in his memoir, Khatarat Ek Pezeshk Avazi, or Memories of a Twisted Physician, the assault arrived on the heels of the preceding day's student protests against then U.S. VP Richard Nixon's visit to Iran, mere months after a U.S.-backed coup d'etat deposed the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and reinforced Pahlavi's monarchical power. Mossadegh presented a problem to the imperial forces in the West. Spearheading Iran's anti-colonial nationalist movement, he strived to nationalize oil. His removal from power didn't bode well for Iran's politicized student population, especially those at UT, whose campus is long known as a font of political dissent. In his memoir, Shariat Razavi, the conjures the same sense of chaos that this reconstruction of the scene of his brother's death conveys. According to his brother's friends, the bell rings unexpectedly in the middle of the day's second session, and students spill out of their classes, curious as to the early termination. They quickly learn that two armed soldiers and their attending chief interrupted a civil engineering class. Upon entering, the soldiers point out two students and claim they were the ones who had been making faces at and mocking them. The chief orders their arrest. As the students are being dragged out against their will, the professor, Shams Malikara, sends word to the dean. Back in the classroom, one student gets up on his desk and starts chanting "Death to the military government," adding that it's impossible to study under the boots of armed soldiers in the suffocating environment ruling over the university. He tosses his books up into the air, jumps out, and runs out of the classroom as the bell starts its untimely ringing at the dean's behest. The corridor is roused from its mid-morning quiet with the same chants that would resonate for the next 25 years leading up to the Revolution of '79. Death to the military government, death to the Shah, death to Zahedi the dictator, long live Mossadegh. The story quickly unravels from here. Shariat Razavi writes that the building was full of soldiers armed with guns. And although the military chief ordered the student protesters to leave the building over a megaphone, the students paid him no mind and kept up their chants of Marg bar Shah, death to the Shah. The chief then threatened to open fire on them, but no one believed that they would shoot students on campus, especially not indoors. As the students would come to realize, the military chief had been cleared beforehand to use violent force against them. Shariat Razavi retells how, quote, suddenly the students' chants of death to the Shah were clashing with the sounds of bullets. Among those shot was his younger brother, Azar. Azar was one of the students who, following a gunshot to his chest and shoulder, struggled with a soldier who in turn ripped through his right thigh with a spear, leaving him to tumble to the ground. Despite his heavy bleeding, his shouts of death to the Shah were hushed, but not silenced. Shariat Razavi ends by painting us a picture, describing how, on the ground, the blood of the wounded mixed with the scalding water running from the radiators punctured by bullets and cascaded down the stairs to create a terrifying tableau. This terrifying tableau is considered a turning point in contemporary Iranian history. For Iranians under the reign of the Shah, this event marked public dissent that was different from, if not entirely separate from, that of discontented clergymen who considered the Shah morally bankrupt and therefore unsuitable to rule. Of the three dead students, Qanshi was a member of the National Front of Iran, Jabhe Milli, while the other two belonged to the Party of the Masses of Iran, Hizb Tudeh. It was the coalition of parties known as the National Front and headed by Mossadegh that helped him nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1951. Students remained active in these parties even after the August 53 military coup that expelled Mossadegh from power, an indication that the emerging movement of youthful dissenters, Iran's future generation of workers, thinkers, and artists, would ultimately jeopardize the continued support of the Shah by his foreign allies, rendering his own deposition imminent. The Bloody Day at UT was thus added to Iran's socio-political calendar as Ruz-e Daneshju, or Student Day, joining a long-standing tradition of commemorative practices valorizing the innocent who died unjustly, as they do with their Shia imams Ali and Hussein during the Hijri months of Ramadan and Muharram, respectively. Pre-revolutionary activities on Student Day were often met with violent encounters between law enforcement and students, ordered by the government and facilitated by educational institutions. Now, to the post-revolutionary observer, it would appear as though such conflict itself is a part of the commemorative traditions of Student Day, meaning the aggressive encounters didn't stop with the revolution and in fact have escalated almost yearly since the UT student uprising of 1999, when the eldest of the war generation were making their way through college. Following its inception, the post-revolutionary state attempted to appropriate the day in its own interest, officially recognizing the three students' victims as revolutionary martyrs. To that effect, a commemorative plaque is proudly on display on the ground floor of Fani. The mirror tablet informs readers that the tragedy would not have come about if it were not for the Shah's incompetence and the involvement of criminal America's agents in the matter, making it abundantly clear that to the post-revolutionary state, the only acceptable sentiment on Student Day is anti-Americanism. However, though the pre-revolutionary state murder of the students was in retaliation for their protests against U.S. interventionism and a desperate attempt to prevent future dissent, the broader purpose of the movement was against socioeconomic injustice and political oppression. By 1999, student protesters felt that these offenses were being committed against them not so much by criminal America as by their own government. The attempts of both pre- and post-revolutionary state have thus proved fruitless as dissent continues to be enacted on this day, regardless of who is policing and what they're watching. 4.5 decades after the revolution and 2.5 decades after the first resurgence of the student movement, Student Day remains or serves as an annual marker of the continued tensions between the leadership of the country and arguably its most influential citizenry. Protests today are still highly charged and met with resistance from campus disciplinarians. While students have not yet again experienced the terror described by Shariat Razavi, there are predictable annual reminders of suppression: shattered glass, broken tree branches, damaged bulletin boards and benches inside and outside the building are familiar sights during the December midterm season at Fani. For many college-age students with even the slightest political awareness, whether pro or anti-government, participation in the protests at the scene of the original murder constitutes a rite of passage. Occupying the space where history happened affords them a portal to becoming a part of this history, upsetting the present and its relation to the past and future, disrupting linear time. UT main campus security tightens around this day. Protesters gather on both sides of the main gate of 16 Azar Street, that's the 7th of December, or Student Day. Signs that call for the freedom of political prisoners, especially detained fellow students, are common sights. And since 2009, and the uprising known as the Green Movement, sporting the color green at demonstrations has been a performative stand-in designating certain demands for reform. Scheduled events are held across other universities nationwide as well, especially universities in Tehran. With deep-seated anxiety over a potential capital-wide protest marked as Commemoration, authorities have become increasingly creative in their methods of control, going so far as, and this one happened while I was in college myself, bracketing a 4-day closure of universities across Tehran under the guise of air pollution during Student Day in 2005, and this was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's first year as president. The university closures are evidence that the state fears the potential for this day. The state has little, if any, recourse for suppressing events honoring the day without destabilizing the operational efficacy of other similar commemorative rituals of mourning that manipulatively fold Shia religiosity into Iranian nationalism. This conflation of religiosity and nationalism plays a powerful role in helping the state maintain its ruling hegemony. For example, we can consider how this plays out during Shab Qadr in Iran, which Muslims believe to have been the night in which the angel Gabriel first revealed the Quran to Muhammad. Shia Hadith and tradition both claim this event occurred during Ramadan, and in Iran, popular historical consensus has been that the night falls on either the 19th, 21st, or 23rd of the month. Overnight vigils are held on all these nights, and Islamic scholars have claimed that fates for the coming year are decided and written on the 19th, confirmed on the 21st, and signed into finality on the 23rd. 2 of these 3 nights happen to be additionally crucial to Iranian Muslims, as they overlap with the events surrounding the assassination of the Prophet's son-in-law, Ali, who is considered by Shiites to be the first caliphate to rightfully succeed him. Thus, a series of otherwise hopeful nights, nights of praying into existence a better fate for the year ahead, are mingled with grief that overshadows the excitement of the latent potentiality of this event. And every year during these 3 nights, not only are Iranians called upon to pray for their future fate, but they are also asked to emerge from their private spaces in the late hours preceding dawn to publicly and collectively mourn. The tearful laments delivered by the professional orators who narrate the story of the deadly strike of a poison-coated sword inflicted upon Ali don't stop at calling out the historical injustice. History collapses in this ritual while symbols coalesce. The orators turn the story to the present, inviting mourners to extend their scorn to all power-hungry domestic and foreign agents, encouraging preventative actions against such unjust actors, lest history repeat itself. This foundational othering, deeply rooted through its abuse and use of the circulating grief and human vulnerability in the face of loss, is an indispensable means of patriotic revival practiced annually by the state. The commemoration of Ali exemplifies why mourning the death of the innocent lost in their fight for what is in God's way is not just considered a matter of respectability, but absolutely necessary to the continuity of the post-revolutionary state. The state is the only jury deemed fit to make the final decision on that designation. Dying in God's way, or martyrdom, is not achieved through unjust death, but death found unjust by the state. The state has devoted considerable energy and resources in the service of obscuring its role in determining what is just, presenting justice and injustice as absolutes, and stands to lose the most if this normalized mentality were to be shaken. The problem that Student Day poses to the state, then, arises from the fact that having already signaled its acceptance of the 3 dead students as martyrs, it cannot revoke the appellation and must live with its inability to fully corral the narratives of these deaths. Having bestowed this title, but with little control over the enactment of the commemorative practices, brings to the fore the deep complexity of mourning, specifically when mourning is used as an ideological tool by the state. Doubt as to why the state confers value on certain lives and deaths, and about who is accountable for the losses after a regime change, causes glitches in the work of mourning for both the state and the students. Cast in doubt, mourning becomes a space in which new visibilities are offered. Carried out publicly, this practice creates a place for real politics, one rooted in the dissensus that challenges the status quo, which is a threatening prospect for any authoritarian regime. The state thus finds itself overseeing narrative doubt in order to curtail it. Now, on the other hand, the opposition has held tenuously to the fancy of overnight radical reform. It remains unclear whether this pipe dream casts brutality in a desirable or detestable role. While violence against students can incite rage and action in broader society, wary Iranians who are still living out the ramifications of the revolution and war aren't especially open to another hasty overthrow of power with an unpredictable outcome. It can be inferred from this ambiguity that if the date weighs heavy, it's primarily due to the ambivalence it both brings to light and breeds. If politics is defined as, quote, the debate or conflict between individuals or parties hoping to achieve power, then in Iran, the political is mapped onto the structure of mourning. And this structure is what is charted and worked through visually in Akhlaqi's By an Eyewitness series. The artist claims that each of these deaths was a turning point in the country's formative trajectory, stating that if any of them hadn't died at that particular moment, our history would have been different. Looking through the photographs, it is not always clear if what is crucial to Iran's history is the quality of the deaths of these iconic figures or their lived lives. As the artist's imagination goes to work in making herself a part of the history she depicts, inserting herself into each scene, so too the fiction of the history handed down to her generation is imaged for all to see, say, and mourn. In their own examination of the grievability of some losses of life versus the ungrievability of others, Judith Butler contends that it's the limits of the seeable and the sayable that, quote, circumscribe the domain in which political speech operates and certain kinds of subjects appear as viable actors, end quote. That is, such limits determine which lives count as lives and whose deaths matter. Upon closer inspection, By an Eyewitness helps us interrogate these very limits by infusing the tales of subjects with narrative doubt, which in turn enables us to revisit why these deaths mattered. By highlighting the power struggle around the official accounts of these deaths, the series illuminates how it is that in Iran, the political regime of mourning continues to strive. Now, before I get ahead of myself, you might be asking, why stage all this death? Why regenerate the mourning machine? When asked what prompted the project, Akhlaqi has cited the violent aftermath of Iran's contested 2009 presidential election. Given the deaths of victims of state brutality that summer were digitally captured and then shared via social media platforms, unencumbered by state censorship, she grew preoccupied with how their predecessors, deprived of such technologies of visibility, were also deprived of certain facets of public mourning. Akhlaqi's search for a mournable history led her to the idea of seeing history rather than knowing it. For 3 years, she dug beyond official sources as she sought out eyewitness accounts, memoirs, and interviews to patch the holes in the historical archive. These unofficial sources helped her unearth sensory details that could tap into the immediacy of the experience. So think weather, mood at the death sites, the trending dialogues and debates of the day. She was thus allowed to prioritize the spirit of the moment over factuality and historical precision. But Akhlaqi's patch of the archive is also incomplete. The patch itself is and can only ever be partial, leaving gaps even as it's stitched over the torn fabric of historical memories. This should come as no surprise. The archive, the audiovisual, Gilles Deleuze held, following Michel Foucault, is disjunctive. Expansion of the archive, then, can only happen if we are to accept the lacuna that come with the stories. The seeming paradox of mending the archive by puncturing it anew with even more ambiguity, with faulty memories essentially, is worked into the project rather than against it. So is, at first glance, a reinforcement of the cultural habituation to ocular hegemony. The privileging of vision over other senses is critiqued elsewhere by Rebecca Schneider, who cites Cobina Mercer's work to underscore this Western line of thought that equates the visual and the knowable. In her 2011 book, Performing Remains, Schneider both contests the archival logic that characterizes performance as impermanent and undocumentable, and teases out other ways of knowing and remembering overlooked in the failure to consider the modes in which performance, so any event really, remains, albeit differently. While by an eyewitness does appear to privilege vision initially, a careful look tells us otherwise. The artist's conceptual approach actually reveals the depth of our own affliction with the privileging of the Western epistemological canon. The project asks us to consider whether seeing itself should be seen differently. That is, by advancing the idea of seeing history rather than knowing it, and by differentiating between knowing and seeing, the artist assumes a position outside of dominant forms of knowledge production and transmission. Her project disrupts the equation between the ocular and knowledge by problematizing what it means to know history, asking what the limits of this knowledge are, and forcing us to muse over what it means to know history that we have not seen. If seeing is decoupled from knowing, if the two are placed in opposition, does this seeing let us sense history then? Is this sensory distinction a comment on the differences that derive from when and how we experience historical details? Akhlari's photographs use actors and models as placeholders. If anything, the historical sense prompted by her work is unique in that while it attempts to fill holes in the audiovisual archive, it also forces doubt onto the accuracy of any pictured image, be it a duplication or an artistic rendering, reaffirming photography's position as what Jacques Rancière calls paradigmatically ambivalent practice situated within the zone of indeterminacy between art and non-art. So far, these are a couple of paradoxes on display. Another is the contradictory conditions of death. Its inevitability and unpredictability are brought to the surface and framed together in uneasy proximity, as are the apparent paradoxical byproducts of death, disappearing and remains. Together, these elements raise questions as we make our way through the series. How does one prepare for the promised death of others? How does one document it or mourn the failure to do so? How can the failure to mourn take on collective force? And finally, the paradoxical question of mourning, the fact that, as Jacques Derrida notes, consists always in attempting to ontologize remains, to make them present in the first place by identifying the bodily remains and by localizing the dead, end quote. How does one negotiate the need to maintain a relationship with the dead and the need to abandon the libidinal position vis-a-vis a now lost object? For Akhlari, the connection here seems to be between seeing history and sharing memories and mourning. Coming to an understanding of history not through knowledge, but rather with sight as a guide to the sensible and thus into the affective. Seeing becomes a collaborative performance, what we may call, after Derrida, a spectropoetic process that rethinks and resituates the site of any knowing of history as body-to-body affective transmission of showing and telling, or what Schneider would term a reparticipation in history by means of an affective remain, one which, in its performative repetition, is a queer kind of evidence. For gallery goers rounding the historical displays, such difficult questions are juxtaposed with another discomfiting presence, the eerie bystander present in each shot marked by a red scarf. Akhlari poses as witness to the deaths she stages, undermining as she does the research backing her recreations and disrupting linear temporality in addition to the notion of the camera as a neutral evidentiary instrument. By placing herself in the frame as both the witness who details the events, the one who sees history, and the archive excavator who uncovers and then recovers the details in a graphic reenactment, Akhlaqi gets to the heart of one of trauma's paradoxes, the singularity and specificity of its experience as the very reason it exceeds conventional documentation. She invites us to resolve this paradox by taking a, quote, journey backward, not through memory or mind or analysis or reading or writing, but through our very flesh and blood, which seems profoundly attached to the moment, end quote. In proffering this invitation, her project yet again defies the conventionally held logic of the archive, where, as Steiner notes, quote, flesh is given to be that which slips away and thus can house no memory of bone. In the archive, only bone speaks of flesh. Flesh is a blind spot, dissimulating and disappearing, end quote. This challenge to archival thinking is familiar to those who claim orature, storytelling, visitation, improvisation, or embodied ritual practice as history. Those for whom performance does leave residue. Akin to Akhlaqi's artistic conceptualization, Schneider argues that in a network of body-to-body transmission of affect and enactment, this performance residue is to be found in, quote, flesh as the bearer of evidence across generations. By following Akhlaqi's own fleshy flight across the recreated scenes, it becomes evident that in embodying the role of witness to violent deaths in the recent history of Iran and participating in its economy of hypervisuality, the artist visually narrates the collective memories that entrap her generation. A people destined to relive these traumatic experiences, to suffer for what Hamid Dabashi refers to as their Shia sin. However, her self-proclaimed journey does not stop at narration. By enacting her own gradual disappearance, moving in and out of the shadows in her imagery, becoming a reflection in a mirror, and finally becoming nothing more than a red scarf left behind, Akhlaqi opens up a path out of the space of fatalism so ubiquitous in everyday Iranian sociality. By ghosting herself, becoming the one who at once returns in every image and makes her apparitional debut in different moments of the historical past, the artist inhabits the paradoxical temporality of the revenant and steps into a fleshy spectrality that merges the past and present in clear fashion, interimplicating these historical moments with the future. This escape is made possible through collective mourning and its place in the Iranian imaginary and archives. Akhlaqi's project, by the way, was funded by one of Tehran's leading art spaces, Mohsen Gallery, as part of the gallery's initiative to subsidize emerging artists and create new trends in the country's art scene by embracing subcultural ingenuity despite the risky business that is Iranian contemporary arts. The precarity underlying the artistic practice in Iran, imposed by the strict state control over cultural production, is sometimes an unbearable burden for art makers and curators who, like their global counterparts, also deal with occupational volatility regarding income, insurance, international mobility, and labor conditions. While public thirst for new art, digital, visual, installation, and multimedia, that showcases in Iran not found in those representations produced solely in the service of the state is palpable, there is still no guarantee that artwork will be permitted a public showing, that an exhibition won't be taken down suddenly after its opening, or that a gallery space won't be shut down without warning. These factors certainly leave room to question the extent of artistic liberty allowed Akhlaqi's project, especially regarding the time span it covers. The first of the 17 scenes depicted in Akhlaqi's series occurred in 1908, the last in 98, 45 years prior to and after the shooting of the UT students. This 90-year time span leaves out the post-revolutionary state brutality that resulted in the death of citizens, including victims that belonged to the student uprising of 99. Akhlaqi has commented that this exclusion was intentional because it was her safest bet to both exhibit the project and continue to work inside Iran. And her work has been summarily criticized for this very reason, for playing it safe. In a country where rigid state control over representational forms has given the state a powerful upper hand in manipulating public opinion in its favor, art is considered to be a service in combating this monopoly. Those who subscribe to the criticism that this work avoids the current political situation question the ethical efficacy of the project, doubting whether images that obliquely disavow the present moment can mobilize Iranians in a demand for socio-political change. These critics contend that if Akhlaqi's intention is to challenge the current power hierarchy that determines the visibility of certain subjects, it's imperceptible to spectators. But, as Rancière warns, to believe that there is a, quote, straight line between perception, affection, comprehension, and action can lead to skepticism regarding the political capacity of any image, end quote. I propose that this critique misinterprets the incentive concept behind Akhlaqi's project, which can be more realistically extrapolated from her artist statement than via the presumptions plaguing political art in Iran. She writes, "Is it possible for a moment in present time to become so tumultuous and critical as to break the linearity of time, bring the past to the present, and thrust the dwellers of the present to the past?" The point of departure of this project derives from the shock, a collective shock of the present, rather than a historical preoccupation, and is a meditation on these possibilities. Perhaps what I bring to the fore is nothing more but utopic daydreaming, one of those candid, optimistic moments that comes around during abrupt social cracks and collective hopes. This is perhaps imagining the simultaneity of us and the dead we admire in an essentially different time, the time that is yet to come. When I look at By an Eyewitness, what I see is a pictorial narrative of trauma, a retrofuturistic retelling of the war generation's historical trajectory, a trajectory full of lost starts, false starts, and lost posterity, one that is more concerned with how the shock of the present interimplicates the past and future. These photos evoke Kathy Kruth's argument that a history is a history insofar as it recalls for us the ways in which we are implicated by the trauma of others. This looping retelling is reminiscent of the repetitive time of trauma and echoes Schneider's rethinking of the site of history as ritual repetition, which lets us, quote, refigure history onto bodies, thus altering our experiential relations to historical knowledge. If the archive is the storage house of history, as it's conventionally thought to be, then we would be remiss not to consider how this reorientation towards history and its alternative architectures of access dislodge the temporalities of our archives. Akhlaqi's performance of death certainly takes up this feat. The series performs a Derridian archive that refuses to posit the past as past. The past instead encounters the present in an interface that happens to be the future, expressed in her artist statement as an essentially different time, the time that is yet to come. In this new temporal configuration, where the future functions as the go-between for present and past, the archive becomes the place that houses transgenerational memory that, by virtue of contract across time, calls into the coming of the future as future, calls into question the coming of the future as future. The archive's biggest secret, suggested in this Derridian approach and called out by Schneider, is its tendency towards storing materials for the future of their reenactments. This is much in the same way that a play script is penned and kept for potential future dramatization. Both of these approaches help sustain a future for pasts that have not yet taken place. The past is thus upended rather than preserved. As it's folded into a deferred future, the what will have been, the question of the archive should be rewritten too, as Derrida notes, as, quote, a question of the future, the question of the future itself, the question of a response, or a promise and of a responsibility for tomorrow. This question of the future, of an accountability owed to the future by the archive, is addressed by Akhlaqi's Interruption of the Dead. Revolutionaries, a military leader, poets, playwrights, journalists, writers, translators, intellectuals, ideologues, guerrillas, activists, students, a national athlete, a film director, and a deposed prime minister. These are the idealists and ideologists charmed back to life by Akhlaqi, only to die again in an image. This interruption is a performative interpretation, what Derrida would call an hauntology, or ontology, which transforms the very thing it interprets. It's imperative to ask, with a project such as this then, how and where to lead the war generation's historical trajectory next. And so, getting back to the critiques that question the series' potential in mobilizing the collective to bring about political change, I purport that the series never sets out to do so because the collective Akhlaqi is interested in addressing the war generation who have been willingly taking on the weight of political dissent are already mobilized, on the streets, protesting, sometimes arrested, even dying. Also, and as Suzanne Sontag has proclaimed, the meaning of photographs is never determined by a photographer's intentions. It's instead guided and decided by the, quote, whims and loyalties of the diverse communities that have uses for it. This photographic series is a grand promise to this mobilized unit and the state alike, a promise that this generation won't allow their labor, their suffering, or even their deaths to be in vain. The precious support of the dead we admire that Akhlaqi cites exceeds a mere spiritual connection. The tangibility of the imagery materialized by the artist shows that disconnection, i.e. the doubts often referred to as narrative gaps, can be opened wide and entered to ensure that new stories, or microhistories, can be told about the past, that unlived past can have their futures, and new monuments can be built for this future of the past. And to be certain, deciphering Akhlaqi's intention wouldn't go far in determining the efficacy of her project anyway. The work carried out by the photographs intervenes in the regulation of the sphere of appearance to offer an opportunity for the enactment of politics on a broader societal platform. These images in the series create a sense of community for mourning in both injustices past and lost futures, while also touching on the very present they avoid. The historical narrative put on view by the photoset performs on two separate levels. On one level, this narrative deals in reality, while in the other, it floats in fiction. And in this way, it manages to grapple with a social imaginary rooted in the politics of religio-national myth and fertilized by the necrolatry of Persian poetry. This duality inheres within what the Italian tradition of historiography dubs the microhistorical, an approach that aspires to the Tolstovian conviction that a, quote, historical phenomenon can become comprehensible only by reconstructing the activities of all the people who participated in it, end quote, all the while conscious of the unrealizable nature of such a project. For Carlo Ginzburg, an early proponent who had a hand in the development of the field of microhistory, the need for this technique arose out of the traditional tradition of historians to set aside the hapax legomenon, or what is documentarily unique, so as to construct a documentary series for the sake of producing historical knowledge. Those in Ginzburg's camp argue that the so-called hapax legomenon does not exist. Quote, any document, even the most anomalous, can be inserted into a series and can, if properly analyzed, shed light on still broader documentary series, end quote. In other words, quote again, the obstacles interfering with research in the form of lacuna or misrepresentations in the source must become part of the account, end quote. Microhistory accomplishes this by accepting these constituent limitations and transforming them into a narrative element. So what are microhistories? They're considered small-scale investigations, often of a unit such as a village, sometimes even an individual, such as the contended heretic in Ginzburg's The Cheese and the Worm. And so access to the worlds of their subjects is usually limited to sources generated by people who stood in opposition to their cause, rendering the reconstruction of their lives as narrative history in some ways a paradoxical project. The task of the microhistorian, as set forth by Ginzburg, is to resist filling the gaps in documentation to form a polished surface. These gaps are to be folded into the account, along with the hesitations and silences of the historical protagonists, that is, the underdogs that microhistory embraces. For example, in Ginzburg's account of the 16th century miller Minocchio, who was burnt at the stake, quote, the hypotheses, the doubts, the uncertainties became part of the narration. The search for truth became part of the exposition of the necessarily incomplete truth attained, end quote. Akhlaqi's subjects are dead or dying, and rather than use them to rehash the overarching narrative of 20th century Iranian history, she's preoccupied herself with the events of their deaths and the fragmentary, distorted traces of these events, and inevitably with the gap between the two. The gap between the deaths and their traces creates the capacity for a leap toward direct contact with reality. What Ginzburg maintains above all is a need to bridge over the gaps by employing narrative elements in lieu of doing away with them, as conventional historical accounts do. Keeping narrative doubt and ambiguity in play, we might come to question with Ginzburg the notion of true history and absolute reality put forth by traditional historicity and attend to the question of memory as the existence of things in themselves. That is, we can attend to how every historical account of the way in which the past and its events have existed is in effect based on a memory constructed as such. Prime examples of this gap and Akhlaqi's embodiment of narrative doubt are on display in two of her bloody depictions, so I'll end with these, and yes, you heard that right, I'll end with these two. The first image from April 18th, 1975 shows 9 men blindfolded, slipper-footed, decked in unremarkable button-down shirts and baggy pants, facing uniformed officers whose hands and faces overlap and merge as they raise their rifles, feet aligned and planted firmly on the ground. The caption in the exhibition catalog names only one man, along with the location of the clash, Evin Hills, Tehran, Bijan Jazari. Of the 9 victims, 3 are already on the ground, another 3 appear mid-tumble, and 2 await the burn of bullets with each new shot, while each new shot pierces the air. The final figure shows nothing of himself but a ghostly shadow, shrouded in white and hidden by the bronzish dust kicked up in the kerfuffle. We can only ascertain that he is, in fact, a 9th man because Akhlaqi's source for the re-imaging newspaper article is reprinted on the catalog page across from the photograph. Dated 2 days after the shooting, April 20th, the article announces the killing of 9 prisoners as they attempt a jailbreak while being moved from one prison to another. Below the snippet, another news article from the same newspaper, Etelat, dated 4 years, 1 month, and 1 day later, is headlined Tehrani, Savak's executioner, confesses. Savak is the acronym used to refer to the Shah's secret police. Printed in June 1979, we can surmise that the confession was obtained post-revolution, but under what circumstances, we have no way of knowing. Regardless of the degree of credibility, Tehrani is understandably vague on details. There were at least 4 or 5 officials involved in the slaughter, as he recalls being the 4th or 5th person to open fire once a rifle was handed to him. Aside from his own, 5 other names are dropped in the confession, and all are presumably in some way involved, but the only perpetrator who is singled out as such is Saadi Jalil Isfahani, who's shot in the head those who were not already dead to finish them off. Tehrani claims that those who carried out the murder were unaware of the plan until the final moments preceding the act, and that prisoners were killed in retribution for their role as the, quote, intellectual leaders, end quote, that was just the title he gave them, behind the assassination of state figures friendly with Savak, all of which had happened while they were incarcerated. The details here are murky, the circumstances cloaked in mystery, the narrative gaps are many, and to be sure, only one experience of the event ever had the possibility of being relayed by someone who, by virtue of being on the wrong side of power following the revolution, may well have been under pressure to make certain statements in exchange for his life. The image shows us the haziness of this history. In every other photograph, the artist, in her red scarf, appears in clear view of the camera, gazing onto the scene, even as she sometimes recedes into the shadows, or in one eerie instance, staring into the lens from among the crowd gathered for the pre-burial ablution ceremony of progressive Shia cleric Mahmoud Talagani. In stark contrast, in the 1975 photograph taken in the hills of Evin, all the victims who could have borne testimony to the murders are blindfolded. Akhlaqi has disappeared, it would seem, into the fabric of her red scarf, which lies on the ground behind the political prisoners. The scarf's muted repose performs on 2 levels in the 1975 restate shooting. On one hand, the scarf is a sign. Akhlaqi has been there in so much as she has been in any of the other scenes. That is, she has done her research, acquired as much information regarding the day as possible. The scarf signals Akhlaqi as artist and archive excavator. On the other hand, the scarf is a metaphor, symbolizing the materiality of the residue left behind by trauma on our flesh, in our memory, or in our documents and archives, even as something of us is left behind when collective traumas unfold. Trauma takes and undertakes. It takes root in the unconscious while the body reperforms its out-of-time experience. The fact that the image of Evin Hill's firing squad recalls Jahangir Razmi's bone-chilling capture of the firing squad that gunned down 11 men convicted as counter-revolutionaries in 79 Iran, and is a clear reference to Francisco Goya's the 3rd of May 1808, reinforces this understanding of the traumatic trace. Any representation of trauma is always necessarily incomplete. Trauma exceeds itself, and this photographic recreation reminds us that no matter the medium of representation, trauma, photographed or painted, can only ever be evoked, never quite shown. This deficiency is further compounded in case of collective traumas and the painful politics they either do or fail to dredge up. And yet, this falling short need not lead us to rebuke the photograph, to question its double power in depicting and corroborating atrocity. If anything, it can and should force reflection on our part about the impure nature of most historical evidence. Many staged photographs, Sontag observed by looking at canonical photographs of early war photography, turn back into historical evidence even after they have been recognized as fictitious. She further wrote of how, while narratives of trauma can help us grasp the past, photographs haunt us. If we recognize the ontology of photographs of trauma as such, then we can pull this understanding alongside Diana Taylor's view of performance as that which, occurring in the ghostly moment, of post-disappearance, makes visible for an instant that which is already there, the ghosts, the tropes, the scenarios that structure individual and collective life. As Taylor states, and this photo series strives for, making apparitions momentarily visible can alter future phantoms, future fantasies. In this case, the alteration starts with a shift in collective memory, which for Sontag is a fiction in that it is not a remembering, but a stipulating, meaning where a group decides that a certain version of an event was of consequence and locks the story into their minds via imagery, poster-ready photographs that are the visual equivalents of sound bites. So-called collective memory is formulated. Akhlaqi's images seem to want to either tell a story or an old story differently. In both cases, her artistic approach, taking photographs of staged historic events, enacts Sontag's claim. With her photographs, people can revisit and refresh their memories of what they have chosen to think about as a group. Moreover, to conjure Sontag again, we know that sentiment is more likely to crystallize around a photograph. And to echo Taylor, some enactments leave a trace. In this instance, owing to their abiding nature, both the photograph and the sentiment around through the reenactments can continue to act politically long beyond her audience's initial exposure to the work. Trauma also leaves a trace, though it is one that usually resides on and in the surface. Trauma studies that has been widely argued based on Freud's 1914 essay, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through, stands to take a page from performance studies scholarship, seeing as trauma, much like performance, is, as Richard Schechner tells us, never for the first time, it is always for the second to the end time. The second to the end time of trauma is what Akhlaqi tenderly embodies in the second image I mentioned. She sits in the mirror, merely a reflection, looking over the dead corpse of Hamid Ashraf, a founding member of the Organization of Iranian People's Fedai Guerrillas, a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group. Ashraf was ambushed and shot down along with 9 members of the group at the Mehrabad South House by Savak on June 29, 1976. Akhlaqi's stare repeats itself again and again, infinitely in the mirror, but never for the first time. Her position tells us that this death was without witnesses as well, that those who were asked to identify the body were asked to do so after the fact. These witnesses to the corpse, pulled out from their prison cells, stand over Ashraf, only momentarily allowed to peer out from under the bags and blindfolds to confirm his body. They gaze downward, never knowing what happened, only aware of the fact of death after the traumatic act has occurred. Akhlaqi's recreations, then, are microhistories that keep narrative doubt intact in the balance between the real and the fictional, and harness it for an inverse function in the service of soliciting new microhistories as well. They recall Rancière's crafty observation that, quote, "The images of art do not supply weapons for battles. They help sketch new configurations of what can be seen, what can be said, and what can't be thought, and, consequentially, a new landscape of the possible. But they do so on the condition that their meaning or effect is not anticipated." Thank you.